Hi, Aztecs. Welcome to part 3 of chapter 6, skeletal system. This one is about embryology, or how bones are built. So before we go into that, let's just review our heroes of the skeletal system. The cells, of course. The osteogenic cell, remember what that does? Remember, that is a stem cell. Yeah, you're right. So and a stem cell can create all other types of cells or several other types of cells. So for example, when given a signal, a molecular signal, the osteogenic cell can differentiate into an osteoblast, and then that osteoblast can start making organic bone matrix. And then the osteocyte, remember our old buddy, the osteocytes, they live in lacunae in the osteon, which is a structural unit of bone. And then the osteoclast, these guys, look at all these nuclei. So they're multinucleate, and they actually break down bone. Why would you want to break down bone, you ask? Well, if your blood is low in calcium, calcium homeostasis is really important. So your body will send osteoclasts to break down bone. When you break down bone, you release the calcium that's stored in the bone. That calcium goes into the blood and then restores your blood calcium homeostasis. Here's your skeletal system. How did you build it? Do you remember back when you were a little zygote in your mother's uterus? Then you were a blastula, then you were an embryo, then you were a fetus. Remember how you built your bones? Well, if you don't remember, I'll tell you. I'll remind you how you did it. So this is a snapshot of a 12-week-old human fetus, and you can see that there's a dye for bones. So the dye just goes in, just targets the bone. So you can see the skeletal system of a 12-week-old fetus. So for example, there's not a dye that targets the heart, so you don't see the heart. I mean, it's there, but you just don't see it. So there's two ways to make bone when you're in utero. The first type is called intramembranous ossification. So remember, anytime you see ossify, osseous, any of that, always think bone. So intramembranous ossification, that is a process that you used when you were a fetus to build your cranial bones. So for example, the frontal bone, the temporal bone, and the parietal bone, and the occipital bone back here, you use the process of intramembranous ossification. To build your long bones and irregularly shaped bones that are not cranial bones, you use the process of endochondral ossification. And that's all these bones. So for example, the humor and the radius, etc., you used endochondral ossification to build those bones. So remember, I told you that if you see any chondra, that term in any form, think cartilage. So in endochondral ossification, what you actually do, cleverly enough, is you lay down a cartilage template, and then you turn that cartilage template into bone, and you make all these various bones. Intramembranous ossification, you don't use a cartilage template. You use a sort of a membrane to make your bone. Ossification is also known as osteogenesis, or genesis is creation, as you know from the Bible, and osteo is bone, so creation of bone, aka ossification. So that process of making your bones begins in the second month of development. That's when it starts. The process starts. So the second month would be like at week 5. At the beginning of week 5, you would start the process, and then this, of course, is a snapshot of 12-week-old. So you've gone through the process, and you've built these long bones and flat bones. Then once you're born, that's postnatal. So bone growth will continue. As you know, you can get taller and thicker bones. You can get longer and thicker bones until early adulthood. And then after that, your bone is continuously remodeling, and if it breaks, it can repair itself. So let's look at endochondral ossification first. And in this cartoon, this is a cartoon of bone formation in utero, or when you're an embryo. So just briefly, remember I told you if you're trying to form this long bone, so this long bone, hopefully you recognize it's a long bone. You would start with the blue. Remember, blue in anatomy and physiology textbook is oftentimes cartilage. So you start with a cartilage template, and then you start to kind of break down that cartilage template, and you break it down more, and you break it down more. And as you're breaking down the cartilage template, you're actually adding bone. And then at the end, you'll just have a little bit of this articular cartilage. Remember, articular is because it's a joint. It's forming an articulation. You'll have articular cartilage at the epiphysis. And then you'll have this epiphyseal line here and here. So endochondral ossification, you develop your bone by replacing a hyaline cartilage template. And then before you are an actual bone, so when you are a little embryo and you just have pre-bones, they're called endochondral bones because they're mostly cartilage. Endochondral ossification is used to form most of the bones of your skeleton. And then intramembranous ossification, your bone develops from a fibrous membrane. And we looked at the flat bones, so you form these flat bones of the skull using intramembranous ossification. And also you form the clavicles, which I think this little thing here is a clavicle, this little guy right there. And then this is a cartoon that we're going to use to talk about how you use intramembranous ossification to form your flat bones in the clavicle. So we'll use these two cartoons to talk about intramembranous ossification. Okay, so endochondral ossification, let's get into some details, forms most of the bones inferior to the base of the skull. So here's the base of the skull. And most of the bones inferior to that, so remember your terms, this would be inferior, this would be superior. So inferior to the base of the skull, you use endochondral ossification to form your bones, except the clavicle, you use intramembranous ossification. And we talked about this, you use a hyaline cartilage model, so when you're a little embryo in utero, you lay down this hyaline cartilage template. And then the hyaline cartilage model or template, like we said, has to break down. And then that area that gets broken down will become ossified, and then you'll have sweet bone. All right, so now we're going to look at even more details. So here's our hyaline cartilage template. And there's this little area here. It's called the primary ossification center. And then the kind of like a dog collar, I guess, embryonic bones have a collar. So this area in here that actually looks like it'll become the diaphysis, this is the bone collar. So then you have bone collar here, and bone collar here. The bone collar keeps getting longer and longer. And then in this next step of the cartoon, we talked about the cartilage will deteriorate. So every place here where you see there's no longer blue, but you see this kind of brown stuff, that's deteriorating cartilage. And then you'll have this thing called a periosteal bud. So remember the periosteum, that's the outer covering of bone, and then a bud would just like a little bud on a plant. And then as you move along, you'll eventually, that primary ossification center will turn into this thing called a medullary cavity. And remember that medullary cavity, that's going to be the center or the hollow part of the bone. And then in addition to a primary ossification center, you'll form these secondary ossification centers at the epiphysis. And then it shows here finally the epiphyses. So this is an epiphysis, this is an epiphysis. The epiphyses will ossify. Okay, so endochondral ossification begins at this primary ossification center in the center of the shaft. So this is the shaft of the bone. And then over time, blood vessels, as it shows here, will infiltrate the perichondrium. So that's that covering of the bone. And then when the blood vessels infiltrate the perichondrium, then that will convert the perichondrium to a periosteum. So the if it's covering the embryonic bone and it's cartilage, it's a perichondrium. If it changes to a covering that's covering the bone part of the template, then it's a periosteum. And then also the underlying, or the cells that lie under the perichondrium or the periosteum, called mesenchymal cells, will then differentiate. They'll get a signal and they'll differentiate into osteoblasts. And do you remember what osteoblasts do? What those cells do? Yeah, they secrete the organic matrix to help form bone. Okay, we just said that. And then it tells you here, so remember this middle part is the diaphysis. So chondrocytes that are in the diaphysis will signal the cartilage to calcify. Once you have calcified cartilage, then nutrients can't diffuse to the chondrocytes, and the chondrocytes die. The chondrocytes die, that means the cartilage will deteriorate, and that's what it shows in this cartoon. And then you get this cavity. But everywhere else, the cartilage out here is still healthy. And then we talked about the periosteal bud will go into these cavities, and you'll start forming the spongy bone that you see inside a long bone. So the diaphysis, this part here, this will get longer. So the diaphysis, or excuse me, that's the epiphysis. So the diaphysis will get longer and longer. So the diaphysis is like this length, and then the diaphysis is this length, and then the diaphysis is this long. So you can see the diaphysis is getting longer and longer and longer as time goes on. And that's, so in essence, you're growing your long bones. And then to hollow out the medullary cavity here, you can use osteoclasts. So here's the thing. If there's chondroclasts as well. So, and remember, these are cells. It's important to know that these are cells. If you're trying to break down the cartilage, if you're trying to break down the cartilage, then the chondroclasts will do that. If you're trying to break down bone, like in this part of the cartoon where it's bone and you're trying to hollow out that medullary cavity, then you'd use osteoclasts. Okay, so this just kind of shows what we've been talking about, but a couple more pieces of information. So this just shows you what's happening in week 9. You get month 3, and then birth, and then this is happening from childhood to adolescence. Your bones are really growing in length at a more rapid rate than when you were a little embryo. So I think I'm just gonna check this. We talked about the bone collar. So it's the bone collar, and you can see the color. So it's actually bone here in the bone collar, because there's not the blue cartilage template. The cartilage deteriorates, so those chondrocytes are chewing away at the cartilage cells. And then we talked about the periosteal bud brings in blood vessels. The diaphysis keeps getting longer, and you get these secondary ossification centers, and you have more blood vessels going into those ossification centers. And then eventually the epiphyses ossify when you're done growing your long bone, you'll only have this articular hyaline cartilage at the epiphysis or at the ends of your long bones. Okay, so we'll talk about intramembranous ossification. So remember, intramembranous ossification you use to make your clavicles, and then basically the flat bones of your skull. So in this cartoon, it just shows if you're trying to make one of these flat bones or clavicle, you start out, you have these guys here. These are called mesenchymal cells. Mesenchymal cells, and then you kind of have this ossification center amidst the mesenchymal cells, and in the ossification center you have our old friend, the osteoblasts. And remember, the osteoblasts make the organic component of bone, the osteoid. So they're making osteoid, and then over time, this picture will look like this picture, and you'll have this osteoid. It will get mineralized, and then all this stuff is, so now you'll have bone here, and specifically it's woven bone. And each one of these, remember, trabeculum, a trabeculum is Latin for beam. So when the scientists saw this, it looked like to them that they were just seeing a bunch of these beams in this bone. So they call this the trabeculae of woven bone. So another name for woven bone is spongy bone. So a woven bone and spongy bone are the same thing. The structures that make up woven bone or spongy bone are these trabeculae. So over time, the ossification center will allow for this woven or spongy bone to form. And then the mesenchyme, or the cells that make up the mesenchymal cells that make up the mesenchyme, condense. So condense, they just get closer together. So can you see here? So they're kind of far apart. Here's a mesenchymal cell. Here's a mesenchymal cell. Now you come over here and look how close the mesenchymal cells are to each other. So that means they're condensing. They're starting to get really close to each other. And they're going to eventually form this periosteum, or that bone covering. And then as you go along in intramembranous ossification, you get the cells, the osteoblasts, kind of line up here on the, remember this is a diploe, so this would be the bread of the sandwich, this would be the other piece of bread, and then all this would be the whatever you like to put inside your sandwich, veggies or meat. So this was, remember, this is called a diploe. So the osteoblasts line up here on the compact bone, and then the diploe, or the spongy bone, is on the inside. And then the fibrous periosteum is on the outside. Okay, so intramembranous ossification begins with fibrous connective tissue membranes formed by mesenchymal cells, and we talked about that here. Intramembranous ossification, the osteoblasts secrete osteoid. We talked about that, and that's the organic component of bone. And remember, the organic component of bone has collagen in it. And then the woven or spongy bone form, the periosteum forms. And then lamellar or compact bone. So remember, you get two names. You can memorize two names for the price of one. Lamellar bone is compact bone. Replaces that woven bone. And then you start getting red marrow in here in the spongy bone. So this just gives you a few more details of what we've just been talking about with intramembranous ossification. So remember, this whole thing is the ossification center where the osteoblasts are. And so remember, keep track of this. The osteoblasts are the cells, and what they make, or what they secrete, is called the osteoid. And part of the osteoid is collagen, and then it shows the collagen fibers here. And then these mesenchymal cells, they are actually going to condense and form the periosteum. Okay. And then we come over here to the next cartoon. It says the osteoid is secreted within the fibrous membrane, and then it calcifies. So you can have the osteoblasts make the osteoid. Now the osteoid is sitting there, but it's not really hard yet because it's just collagen. So you have to allow the blood vessels to bring in calcium and phosphate to make the osteoid turn into hard bone. Okay, and then the third part of the intramembranous ossification series just says the woven bone forms. So this is all woven bone in the diploe, and then out here is the periosteum. And then the last step, this lamellar or compact bone, this stuff here, this is all compact bone or lamellar bone, replaces the woven or spongy bone just deep to the periosteum. And remember, this is all periosteum out here. Okay, so that's it for your little embryonic bone growth. So now you're born. Now you do postnatal bone growth. So that's called interstitial or longitudinal growth. This is where you're trying to increase the length of your long bone. You're also increasing the width of your long bone, but the longitudinal growth of your long bones is called interstitial growth. So here's the end of a long bone. So here's the articular cartilage. So it's made of hyaline cartilage. And then you've got cartilage in here. And in the process, what happens to grow your long bones, you're going to have bone replacing cartilage, and that's going to allow for your bone to elongate in both directions. And then if you're trying to make your bone thicker or stronger, that's called appositional growth. So it increases the diameter of your bone. So if you look here, this looks like, oh, there's the trochlea and capitulum. So this looks like it's a humerus. And then they take this cross section and then they pull that cross section out so that you can look at it on face. And here's the cross section of the diameter of a bone in an infant. And then as you grow your bone in thickness, you can see it goes from being like this thick. So here'd be the marrow cavity, this thick to being thicker. So, and then that's a cool molecular process that allows you to do appositional growth. Okay, appositional growth, like we just said, allows a bone that's getting longer. It allows that bone to get wider. So this just shows a cartoon. We were kind of looking at the same thing on the last slide, but here's the medullary cavity. We showed that. So remember, this periosteum is that connective tissue covering on the outside. And then this is all compact bone. And it's got a certain thickness as an infant. And then look how it gets thicker. So your child gets thicker. Young adult, that compact bone is even thicker. And then look how thick it is as an adult. And if you're like a power lifter, it'd be really thick because you're putting a lot of stress on the bone. Growing your bones in width occurs throughout your life. Your bones can get wider or narrower. The osteoblasts that live beneath the periosteum will secrete the bone matrix onto the external bone, and you can grow your bone in width. And then osteoclasts can remove bone on the endosteal surface. So that's what it shows here. Bone is being deposited by osteoclasts, or osteoblasts, sorry, because the osteoblasts live just beneath the periosteum, and they're making osteoid here, and you're making a bone. And then in the lining of the endosteum here, you've got some osteoclasts living there, and they do bone resorption, or breaking down of bone. Okay, so this shows the growth in length of long bones. So this is postnatal growth. There's 5 zones that you actually grow your long bones from postnatally to when you stop growing your long bones. So here's the epiphysis of a long bone. And then they take out this square right here. So they're taking it out of the epiphyseal plate. So part of the epiphyseal plate will be here in this cartoon. And you can kind of see some of the cells in this. It might just look like a purple, you know, modern art, piece of modern art to you, but they're actually, this is full of cells and cartilage and osteoid. Here's one trick you can do. Anytime you see like a really dark area inside a circle, oftentimes that is a cell. So these are the zones. Up here at the superior part is the resting zone. So that if the cells are resting, that means they're not mitotically dividing. And then from here to here, this is the proliferation zone of your end of your long bones. The cartilage cells are undergoing mitosis, so they're growing and dividing. Then there's a hypertrophic zone where the older cartilage cells get bigger. So like this could be a little cartilage cell, and then this is a older cartilage cell. You can see it's bigger. And then this zone is the calcification zone from here to here, where the matrix gets calcified. So that means calcium and also phosphate comes in and turns that area into hard bone. And the calcification zone, the cartilage cells are dying, chondrocytes are dying. The matrix of the cartilage deteriorates. Blood vessels invade the cavity, because remember, you actually want to start forming bone. And then just below the calcification zone, you have this zone called the ossification zone, and that's where the bone is actually forming. So over here it says this piece right here is a calcified cartilage spicule. So this whole area is a cartilage spicule. Shows here this is an osteoblast depositing bone matrix, so that would be the osteoid. This area is osseous tissue covering a cartilage spicule. So you can kind of see a little bit of a cartilage spicule here, but the osseous bone tissue is going to overlay that and cover it. Because remember, ultimately what you want to do is you want to get rid of the cartilage and put in bone. So long bones grow in length at the epiphyseal plate. That's this area here. You have these 5 zones: resting, proliferation, hypertrophic, calcification, and ossification, or osteogenic zone. The plate maintains this constant thickness, but the rate of cartilage growth on one side, so that'd be this side, is balanced by cartilage deterioration and bone replacement on the other side, which would be this side of the epiphyseal plate. Okay, so just a couple more details. The resting zone, there's relatively inactive cartilage, so these cells are not growing and dividing. Proliferation zone here. The cartilage on the diaphysis side of the epiphyseal plate. So let's check that out. So here's the epiphyseal plate. Here's the epiphysis, and then this is all diaphysis. So this says cartilage on the diaphysis side, so that would be cartilage on this side of the epiphyseal plate is proliferating. So those cartilage cells are growing. And it says the rapidly dividing cartilage cells allow for this pushing of the epiphysis away from the diaphysis. So you're pushing, so this is the epiphysis, here's the diaphysis, and you're pushing those two areas away from each other. And when you do that, you're growing your long bones. And then in the hypertrophic zone here, older chondrocytes closer to the diaphysis, and they're lacunae, so they're living in lacunae. They enlarge and then they erode, and this leads to these little spaces, interconnecting spaces between the chondrocytes and their lacunae. The calcification zone then is actually surrounding the cartilage matrix. It will calcify, so this calcification zone will calcify, and then once they calcify, that means that the chondrocytes can't get any nutrients, so the chondrocytes die and then they deteriorate. And then when the chondrocytes die, you leave these spicules. So these things right here, we talked about those, and that's just calcified cartilage, and that means the cells aren't there. The cartilage is calcified, the cells are dead. And then the spicules, these calcification spicules, they get eroded by osteoclasts. And then then the osteoblasts come in, lay down the osteoid, and start making new bone. And then ultimately, this will form into spongy bone. So you can see up here in our cartoon part, it's going to ultimately form spongy bone, and the diaphysis side of the epiphyseal plate and the epiphysis side of the epiphyseal plate. Near the end of adolescence, so end of adolescence, what is that? 18, 19, 20? The chondroblasts that live up here will divide less often. The epiphyseal plate starts to get thin, so this thing right here, the epiphyseal plate, starts to get thin, and it's replaced by bone, so it's not cartilage anymore, it's just replaced by bone. And then the epiphyseal plate closes, and then you start calling it an epiphyseal line, and then the bone can't lengthen anymore. And that's it. See ya.